Hello, this is the video for portfolio micro teaching session. This is the first section of digital pedagogies in practice, part one. And in this particular presentation, I'm trying to present to demonstrate the usefulness of the micro teaching session in higher education. First of all, I start with a definition. Micro-teaching is a technique which was primarily developed in order to prepare teacher candidates to the real classroom setting. However, the technique was subsequently used for teaching and learning development purposes because it allowed for various teaching styles, methods, and behaviors to be critically evaluated and discussed. The micro-teaching session was created based on the digital learning and development element, which I chose from the digital capabilities framework. And I chose this particular element exactly because I think is much more consistent with the recommended online digital pedagogy that I'm using for this particular assignment. This element involves digital learning and digital teaching activities. In higher education, micro-teaching has been mostly applied as a means of peer evaluation, and for this reason, it is frequently considered to be a training session for all participants and therefore an instrument essentially for teacher training. It offers the lecturer an opportunity to practice teaching activities in a controlled or simulated environment. For the purpose of this assignment, micro-teaching normally involves 5 different sections as follows. The first one is the lecturer illustrates teaching skills. So we have the lecturer who wants feedback from his or her colleagues, and for this reason, he records a session. So the session, in the first place, the session is recorded. The lecturer's colleagues who could be learners, who could be, for example, students within a pilot experiment, observe the teaching skills and attempt to evaluate those according to the expected learning outcomes. In the third stage, the lecturer's colleagues attempt to practice the demonstrated teaching skills themselves in a controlled environment. The fourth stage, the performance of the lecturer's colleagues is analyzed and critically discussed. And finally, decisions are taken in order to further improve teacher performance in the future for everybody. So we start from the lecturer who wants feedback in order to identify areas of improvement, but at the same time, his colleagues also who participate in this critical evaluation of the teaching session, they also recognize the possibilities to identify improvement areas themselves. According to Allen and Ryan in 1969, micro-teaching has the following characteristics. First of all, is a real teaching situation. This is many times underestimated. Is considered to be a laboratory environmental aspect and is not a real-time classroom situation, and for this reason people underestimate its usefulness. However, it is a real teaching session, and it's important to recognize it as such because it reduces the complexity of the real classroom teaching at the same time. So it allows people to really focus on the performance aspects rather than worrying about other aspects associated with a real-time classroom situation. It emphasizes training for mastery of teaching activities such as skills, techniques, methods, and curriculum design. It offers better control over practicing techniques, teaching activities, and techniques because many factors can be easily manipulated to attain a greater degree of control. And finally, the feedback dimension, which is really expanded considerably because the lecturer can receive meaningful feedback immediately after the performance. All these aspects is what really make the micro-teaching session to be very important, particularly in terms of higher education. The following decisions were taken exactly based on the digital capabilities framework. The first decision was really which element, as I mentioned before, to use within the JISC digital capabilities framework. I chose the digital learning, digital teaching, which involves developmental aspects. The second decision was about the learning outcomes of the session. So the learning outcomes of the session are as follows. The first one is to critically evaluate the importance of purpose-specific strategic learning in online higher education. Now, the adjective strategic is really important on this occasion. What I mean by that is that we need a very specific, a very gradual approach towards the demonstration of teaching. So that this particular demonstration should have specific aspects to test. And that's why we call it strategic, because instead of testing the overall performance, we actually expect evidence, expect feedback on specific aspects of the performance. And for this reason, it's a strategic learning environment. The second learning outcome is to explore the theoretical validity of strategy-based learning according to two different models, the evaluation process model and the student empowerment model, which, as we discussed in the first module, this particular module actually was based on the evaluation process model. And the third learning outcome, to consider the role of two online digital pedagogies in delivering strategic learning content, which means online experimental inquiry, inquiry-based digital pedagogy, and gamification or simulation. These are the two online pedagogies that I chose, but the emphasis will only be on the online experimental inquiry rather than emphasizing the simulation gamification aspects. Now, the reason I decided to only focus on one digital pedagogy, the online experimental inquiry, is because I feel that experimentation, the inquiry of trying to experiment with a particular topic, is essentially a very highly strategic learning design, because it allows you to follow a very gradual procedure, but also introduce experimental elements within this approach. And this is the reason I felt that it would be much easier to demonstrate the benefits of this particular online digital pedagogy when we are trying to apply inquiry-based learning designs in practice. The experimental inquiry is considered to be a pedagogy because it allows the critical thinking pathways to manifest themselves while making use of the cognitive and metacognitive skills of the learners. In other words, it first creates the foundation of learning for each learner before demonstrating pathways of knowledge assimilation. So you can see why it is strategic. Finally, the fact that this inquiry is learner driven, it involves a significant element of self-directed learning, and it occurs entirely online, which allows us to characterize this as digital. The second section of this micro-teaching presentation is to discuss the online learning design. The learning design that was developed from the student empowerment model, which I use in the first module, and I'm presenting in Appendix 1 of this document, the main submission document. It capitalizes on student motivation because the student empowerment model was really created to empower students, to enable them to remain motivated. And for this reason, we consider motivation to be the most important driver of learning in this particular digital pedagogy, which means the online experimental inquiry. In the document, I present the ARCS model, ARCS, which is the model created by Keller in 2008. And this model basically gives us an idea of why the learning design should be gradual and should be psychological and behavioral, which means making use of certain behavioral and psychological reactions. And this is important Exactly, because according to Keller's model, motivation is not a static pedagogical trait, but actually its dynamic development depends on the way in which four different conceptual entities influence the teaching and learning process, which means the attention, relevance, satisfaction, and confidence. Again, the four elements of the model are attention, relevance, satisfaction, and confidence. For the purpose of this design, we make the following assumptions based on educational psychological theory. The first one is about attention. The design aims to raise learners' curiosity, but without overwhelming them. So maintaining learners' attention is very important in this regard. So we have a balance to strike between um, trying to raise curiosity, but at the same time avoiding overwhelming people with material. Relevance is something different. The design aims to demonstrate why this particular lesson may be relevant to the learners. And for this reason, we try to connect the dots between the material and the summative assessment of the course, of the module, exactly because the assessment is usually the source of stress for the students, for the learners, and for this reason, the relevance starts from there. The demonstration of relevance should start from the assessment. At the same time, the relevance could be associated with the broader interest of the learners and indeed the employability goals and career goals of the learners. Satisfaction, the design aims to ensure specific teacher-derived rewards when learners achieve specific learning goals in order to ensure that they will remain fully engaged and driven. So satisfaction becomes really much more psychological again, exactly because the teacher is trying to provide rewards to the learners in order to be able to achieve certain teaching goals. Confidence, the design aims to motivate learners with moderate or low levels of confidence in exactly the same way as learners do with high confidence. So essentially, when you can see that certain students are very confident, whereas other students are not, the idea is to have a design which will motivate all learners in the same way. The reason for that is essentially you want to justify the factors that contribute towards confidence based on the substance of the material and not on other processes. So although you can see, for example, as a teacher, that some students may not have pre-existing confidence to be high, you only invest on the value of the material to raise their confidence. Even if that change of confidence is small, that's enough to achieve your goals. And for this reason, we don't worry about the differences in the degree of confidence across different students. We worry about how successful our attempt to raise confidence is going to be for all students involved. Having clarified the usefulness of the model, the next stage is to really identify an effective conceptual framework which will actually make use of the model. We do need a way of combining the different aspects of the process of the learning design, and the ARCS model only provides the final goal. I just mentioned that the ARCS model is associated with the learning outcomes of our teaching session. In this particular case, the micro teaching session. So we do need a complete conceptual framework to make use of the ARCS model. For this reason, the framework that I chose was offered by Punia in 2013, which is considered to be effective in strategy-based learning. And for this reason, I felt it's appropriate for this micro teaching session. The framework was chosen to use for the designing process of the online experimental inquiry, which I mentioned already is the empirical case study, is, if you like, the digital pedagogy, which I chose for this particular session. The conceptual framework involves 4 different stages. The first one, as indicated in figure 1.1 of the module of the submitted document, there are 4 different stages. The first one is the briefing stage of the micro-teaching session. At the briefing stage, the participants are given verbal instructions about the learning outcomes and relevant skills they are expected to practice. This is essentially the phase where the designer, the lecturer, is fully aware of the expected knowledge and learning outcomes associated with the lesson. Furthermore, in operational terms, this is a preparation stage because the lecturer does not know yet the relevant set of corresponding skills that are expected to be practiced or the theoretical underpinnings of the potential content to be created. The second stage is relevant skills and theoretical background. So we need to identify those aspects. This stage engages with the identification of skills relevant to learning outcomes, but also specific instructional teaching strategies which are theoretically validated. Right? So we need to have strategies which are supported by evidence from the literature. In other words, a set of skills must be carefully considered using pedagogical strategies which appear to be supported by academic studies in the literature. Instructional pedagogical strategies could involve a sequence of teaching or interaction activities, learning need assessment, purpose-specific content selection, tools of knowledge evaluation, etc. The third stage, we need a balanced approach towards content creation. Therefore, this stage involves the preparation of different types of content, such as learning, lecture material, presentations, multimedia activities, which involve, for example, online sessions, videos, podcasts, simulation exercises, etc. The term balance is used to designate the importance of having different types of content involved according to the relevant usefulness as perceived by the learners. So each one of those different modalities will have a relative value, a comparative advantage, if you like, compared to other ones. And for this reason, we are choosing them exactly for that comparative advantage. We need the additive advantage exactly to justify why we need a new method or a new multimedia activity. Therefore, the lecturer must interact with his colleagues or learners in order to better carry out this balanced approach. The online instruction design may be viewed as a process of re-evaluating the learning needs of learners in terms of the lesson content and subsequently developing a delivery system to meet identified needs. The balanced content approach aims to ensure the highest possible motivation of the learners. Eventually, we will have the ARCS model, which is the final stage, the ultimate goal, essentially. The 3 stages as described eventually are expected to guide the application of the ARCS model, and the details of this application are going to be presented in the next section, where I'm going to create the prototype material for the lesson. It is important to close, however, this presentation by attempting to further specify the 4 different dimensions of the ARCS model, because I think this contextualization, having presented the usefulness of the micro-teaching session, but also the basic aspects of it, are going to help us to better understand how we can create prototype material, prototype lesson design. So attention could be achieved, now that we presented the details of it, through discussion and contradictions, which means trying to prove something by contradictions. Practical references is another way, humorous approaches, a variety of activities, and inquisitive participation as well. This is a way of catching people's attention. Relevance, drawing upon familiar concepts and experiential learning, discussing professional goals and opportunities for knowledge sharing. Satisfaction, developmental feedback, rewards, which may be associated especially on complex and demanding activities where the learner will have this feeling of satisfaction through the reward, and reinforcement, if you like, reference to real life professional settings as well. Confidence, describing expectations and requirements in simple terms, but also discussing multidimensional feedback provision, graded exercises or quizzes, and a gradual level of difficulty introduced within the activities. So we need to start from easy activities and then start to raise the level of activity gradually. Thank you.